Looking much better and will be set up for a very nice Monday. So I'll have details on that in your extended forecast coming back in just a few moments. Guys, back to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Kyla. More demonstrations are planned, calling for Sacramento police officers to be held accountable for the death of Stephon Clark.
Stephon Clark! Stephon Clark! Stephon Clark!
About 200 people carried signs and chanted into loudspeakers while marching through city streets in Sacramento last night. The group met outside Clark's grandparents' home, where the 22-year-old was shot and killed last year by the Sacramento police. Before the march, demonstrators stood on the corner of Florin Road, holding signs and demanding justice.
Honoring the legacy of Stephon Clark. He left a family, he left kids behind, and we're here to, let his family know, but also let the whole community of Meadowview and Sacramento know that we're not going to forget about the life of Stephon Clark.
It's important just for us to speak on something, create a dialogue. A man died, a father died, so he deserves justice, his family deserves justice, the community deserves justice.
The crowd blocked Florin Road for about a half an hour after the march. Police tell us they were keeping a close eye on the protests. Officers have not said whether they made any arrests overnight. Sacramento County DA Anne Marie Schubert is declining to file charges against the 84 people arrested during Monday's protest in East Sacramento. Dozens of people marched on Monday night, 2 days after Schubert announced she would not charge the officers who shot Clark last year. Also, State Attorney General Javier Becerra said his office reviewed Sacramento police body cam video and video from a sheriff's helicopter. Becerra said Clark was a car burglary suspect who didn't listen to officers' commands, and right before they fired, the two officers said Clark had assumed a shooting position.
Mr. Clark had advanced significantly towards the officers. He was not retreating.
Becerra said his investigation did not look into Sacramento police practices, nor was it meant to review the DA's decision not to prosecute those officers. Joining us now to talk about the fallout from the DA and the state's decision is Stephon Clark killing is Dr. Sherice Nelson. She's an adjunct political science professor at Cal, at Mills College, and at St. Mary's. Good to have you with us, Doctor.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm well. Well, let's just get your reaction. Were you surprised? Because I think the DA said, and so did the Attorney General, he said, we followed the letter of the law and found that the police officers didn't do anything wrong according to the law.
Correct. And so I'm not surprised that there are not any charges being brought. I spent much time for about 8 years in the Washington, D.C. area, and we saw something very similar with Freddie Gray, but we did get charges, and the first officer was acquitted of all charges. And so I think California understood that the letter of the law makes it difficult to prosecute in this way, and so they decided not to bring charges.
Well, let's talk about that, because they're going to protest again tonight in Sacramento. Absolutely. They're upset, but should that protest be not so much aimed at the DA and the Attorney General, but maybe at the legislatures to try to change some of these laws to make it different?
I think it's an and-but situation, right? Yes, we should be protesting the DA, because the protest of the DA then puts pressure on the entire system. But we also have to remember that there has been the systemic criminalization of black men since slavery, right? The Vagrancy Act of 1866, right, made it basically illegal to look for your family members, to travel around after they were freed slaves. And so we see now on the books that law has codified in many ways the criminalization of black men, right? Black men are 5 times more likely to then be shot in an encounter with the police than their white male counterparts, same age, same social economic demographics.
And because of these laws, is that why police officers are not culpable?
Absolutely. The law makes it so that as of right now, all they have to do is present reasonable suspicion or reasonable reason to then use deadly force, right? And we need to have a conversation about the fact that there are officers out there that are already predisposed to see black and brown people as criminals. And so if that is the case, any said action that is then overt will then justify then the use of force.
Assembly Bill 392 removes criminal protection for police officers from prosecution of deadly force if they feel there was some negligence. How do you see that pushing through the legislature, if it does?
Well, I think that it's going to be problematic pushing through the legislature, right? Because I think that the police lobby is very strong. But I think that we have to remember to look closely at what the bill says, right? The bill is not saying that deadly force cannot be used. It is saying that it's in particular instances. It's not a blanket like we currently have. Right now, it's currently a blanket. If I feel threatened as a police officer, then I have the right to use deadly force. And we know systemically that happens more to black and brown people.
And I can see the police side of this too, because maybe they're in a position where they need deadly force, but for that split second they say, oh, wait a minute. And then perhaps they get shot.
Absolutely, but we have to also remember that our police forces have become far more militarized than they were even in the 50s and the 60s. And so now we have high-grade weapons, right? But the training then how to use those weapons, how to use good judgment in those pressure situations, they're not getting the same level of training. And so we have to talk about the disparity, right? The heightened technology, but then the lack of training then to use that technology from a psychological response standpoint.
Well, you teach students at Mills, at Cal, and at St. Mary's. What do they say? What do your students say with Stephon Clark?
As far as Stephon Clark goes, I think it is really an issue dealing with race. So my students of color, my black students, my Latinx students are very concerned, whereas my white students are a little oblivious, right? This happened a year ago. It's not as visible. I do remember when I was teaching at St. Mary's last year, it was more of a conversation. Now for my white students, it's not that big of a deal, but for many of my black and brown students, it's like the ripping of a Band-Aid and reopening of a wound.
Yeah. And where do we go from here?
I think that we have to really just think systematically, right? Because if we think of Stephon Clark as an aberration to the system, then we lose the magnitude of what it means. We have to think about this systematically and what can we do to better train officers, have better community policing, right, where there's better relationships built, and then what can we do from the perspective of the law to change it so that then it gives more rights to the people and it's not really erasing the Fourth Amendment in the Constitution.
All right. Well, Dr. Nelson, thanks for coming in.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate your expertise on a very touchy matter.
Absolutely.
Obviously. Okay. Stay right there. We're still monitoring the computer and the power problem on BART shut down all across the Bay Area. Coming up at 9.